Well, countdown to 2020. Texas could possibly be a swing state in November. A new poll has just come out from the Dallas Morning News showing former Vice President Joe Biden has a 5-point lead over President Trump of the state. Now, this comes as Texas is one of the states that's seen the highest uptick in coronavirus cases, with over 10,000 coronavirus patients in hospitals around the state. Joining me now, former RNC political director and former President Bush 43 senior advisor Mike Duhaime, and former Vice President Biden senior advisor and Transparent Business Chief Transparency Officer Vela. It's great to have you both here, guys.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Mike, I want to start to you first. Texas, always a red state, always. Could Texas go blue?
I don't think it will, but the fact that we're talking about it shows the president's struggles right now. The fact that the coronavirus pandemic has been handled poorly. There are objective metrics that can show you that. For all the arguing around the president's performance on the economy and other things, this is speaks clearly to people that things aren't going well. Just imagine what's going to happen in Texas if they have to cancel high school or college football. I think people are seeing right now that he is just not doing a good job when it comes to this. I think ultimately he will win Texas, but the fact that we're even having this discussion probably makes Mo and the Biden team very happy.
Well, Mo, you're going to respond to that, obviously. No, but I got to say, the one thing about Texas, and I am a Texan, is that, if you look at, if people do vote with their pocketbooks, Mo, then if you look at what's happened to, say, the oil patch, the Permian Basin in Texas, the loss of jobs in the energy industry, on top of the suffering that we're seeing in Houston in particular with those ICUs filled, this could be a reason why Biden may have a shot in Texas.
Oh, I agree, Cheryl. I'm a fourth generation Texan, and I'm proud of that. And I have to tell you, I agree with Mike. The fact that we're even talking about it should give the president tremendous angst. And I do think Joe Biden has a chance in Texas. And I'll tell you why, Cheryl. You being a Texan will understand this. It's not the Texas of even 3 years ago. This is a very different Texas. The demographics have shifted and changed. You have a majority-minority state now. If Latinos and African Americans come out to vote, Donald Trump's in trouble in Texas, I can tell you that.
And what about, Mike, what about Florida? I mean, we're seeing record cases. We've now got a hot spot that is Florida, Mike, and that is something else that we're watching the polling. It's showing us that is hurting the president right now.
Yeah, the president absolutely needs to win Florida. It's been a bellwether for most of our lives watching political campaigns, presidential campaigns. So the fact that Florida continues to rise, the fact that this is going on around the country is really bad, but especially in these places. I think the president had an opportunity early on to work in a bipartisan fashion. There are Democrat governors in battleground states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, where he could have worked with them and shown real empathy toward that. It's just not in his nature to do that. And because of that, people are looking at this now, and this was turned somehow into a partisan fight. Somehow wearing a mask became an ideological litmus test. And that was a huge mistake, because you bet this as a partisan matter. And as long as the numbers continue going the wrong direction, obviously that's going to then reflect poorly for the president.
Yeah, and the economy is the big thing. Mo, I got to ask you about, since you did advise Joe Biden in a past life, yes. I got to ask you about his decision with this economic plan that he introduced, because it really kind of seemed to me to steal a lot of the playbook from President Trump, in particular about, Buy American. How far left is Biden going to go, and why did he kind of, frankly, copy some of the talking points of Trump?
He didn't copy, first of all. But Cheryl, listen, I hear that all over the place. Here's the major difference, Cheryl. There are two words in Vice President Biden's Build Back Better plan that make it completely different than President Trump's initiatives and efforts. And those are the two words are inclusive economy. A Trump economy, which, by the way, he inherited a strong and very good economy from Obama Biden. Let's call an ace and a spade here. He maintained a good economy. Now it is an absolute shambles, and it is a direct result of his ineptitude. Let's not forget the premise why we're even talking about the economy. The other thing I'd say to the president, if he's listening this morning, is, sir, if you want to take credit when it was strong, you're going to get credit when it's disastrous. You can't have it both ways.
Well, I did disagree with you on one point.
Inclusive.
Okay.
What now, Cheryl? I'm sorry.
I disagree with you on one point. I will say that a lot of about whether it was taxes, rollbacks of regulations, pro-business policies, I think that President Trump can take credit for that, to your point. But I'll let Mike respond to your point that is the president going to be dealt with a bad economy, and does he get credited with that? Mike, go ahead.
The president would love to get back to talking about the economy. When the economy was going well, that was really the number one reason the president had a great, or at least a shot to be reelected at that point. The economy was strong, unemployment was low across all sectors. So the president would love to get back to talking about the economy. That's why probably this push to get America reopened as fast as he could. But I really do think he'd love to have a conversation about the economy because it was his greatest strength. For all the questions about the president's performance, he's much better, much stronger when talking about the economy as a businessman, as somebody who lowered taxes, where we saw the unemployment. I don't think people blame him for the high unemployment. They don't blame him for coronavirus coming. There is anger in terms of how it's been dealt with, but there is still time. If the economy saw a comeback by October, that would be good for the president. He'd very much like to be talking about that rather than daily death counts and hospitalization counts.
Mm-hmm. I think we'd all rather.
Cheryl, could I just say one thing on that?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, you know, I don't completely disagree with Mike, but I do on one part, and that is from my experience having sat on the White House Continuity of Government Working Group, not once, but twice in my life. And that was an emergency preparedness working group. And I'll tell you, the reason I disagree with Mike is I do think people blame the president for this disastrous economy, the unemployment, the spread of the virus. Why? Because they didn't plan and prepare in order to prevent. I can speak to this with tremendous confidence, having been in that room preparing for just these types of pandemics.
Okay.
It didn't happen, Cheryl.
Well,
and so because of that, I think the American people understand there's a direct link to the president's inaction.
I have to run, but I will say we'll see how people vote come November. Mo and Mike, guys, thank you very much. Great discussion from both of you. Really appreciate it.